My Mafia boss husband left me to drown in the lake. Now I'm back and he will lose everything. The water still remembers me. That's the first thing you should know before I tell you the rest. My name is Selvaggia Ferrante, and 14 months ago, my husband drove me to the edge of Lake Como, looked me in the eyes, and pushed me into the dark. I want you to sit with that for a second. Not the drowning, not the cold. The look on his face while he did it. There was no rage there, no grief. Donatello Vesperi pushed his wife into freezing water with the same expression he wore when he signed a contract he'd already read twice. Calm, final, done. I remember the sound the water made when it closed over my head. Not a splash, more like a door shutting. I remember my dress, the one he'd chosen for me that morning, the color of a wound, tangling around my legs like it wanted to help him finish the job. I remember thinking, with strange clarity, that I would die in the same lake where he'd promised me forever. I didn't die. I want to tell you it was strength that saved me. It wasn't. It was fury. Somewhere under that pier, clawing at rotted wood and rusted metal, I stopped being a wife and started being a weapon that hadn't been built yet. My fingers found a ladder no one had used in decades. My lungs found one more breath when they had no business finding anything. And somewhere in that black water, the woman my husband thought he'd erased simply refused the ending he'd written for her. He said, "You took from me. Now the lake takes from you." I've had 14 months to think about those words. 14 months to understand that he never once asked if I was guilty. He didn't need to. Guilt was never the point. Convenience was. A rival shipment had been hit, men were dead, and my maiden name, Ferrante, the family his had swallowed whole, gave him somewhere easy to point the blame. It was never about justice. It was about a story he could tell his men that let him sleep at night. He got to keep sleeping. I didn't get to keep anything. Not my name, not my home, not the version of myself who still believed that love, even Mafia love, meant something. But here's what he didn't know when he turned his back on that pier and walked away without checking if I surfaced. I was never the soft thing he married. I was a Ferrante. My family ruled the northern routes for 2 generations before his family absorbed what was left of us in blood and paperwork. There is a version of strength that doesn't announce itself. It waits. It learns to breathe in the dark. And then, when no one is looking anymore, it rises. For 14 months, Donatello Vesperi believed his wife was a stain at the bottom of a lake. He wore black for 3 days. 3, I counted, because someone made sure I knew. And then he expanded his empire like a man unburdening himself of a delay. New territory, new alliances, a new woman on his arm who smiled easily and asked no questions, because women who ask questions tend to end up where I ended up. He thought silence meant I was gone. Silence was never absence. It was preparation. I spent those 14 months in places that don't appear on any map you'd trust. A stolen safe house in Milan with water-stained ceilings, a network of forgotten tunnels under Genoa that smelled like rust and second chances, and eventually, in the company of a man my husband had spent a decade trying to erase from the earth. I'll tell you about him. I'll tell you about all of it. But first, I need you to understand what I found the night I finally stopped running and started planning. My family's ledgers. The real ones. Not the ones Donatello inherited and sanitized for his own men. The ones my father hid before the Vesperis ever came for us. Every dirty deal, every buried body, every senator and judge and police captain who sold his conscience for Vesperi gold. All of it, written in my father's careful hand, waiting 14 years for someone to need it. I needed it. Somewhere out there tonight, Donatello Vesperi is sitting at the head of a table he thinks is still his. He doesn't know the water gave me something before it let me go. He doesn't know I've spent over a year learning exactly how to make an empire bleed from the inside without ever touching a gun. He will know soon. If you're already leaning forward, if some small, vicious part of you is already rooting for the woman who crawled out of that lake, stay close. This is the story of what a man loses when he mistakes cruelty for control, and what a woman becomes when survival is the only door left open to her. If you're already hooked, a quick subscribe keeps the darkness coming, because trust me, this is only the beginning of what the lake gave back. Before the pier, before the water, there was a wedding people still talk about in hushed voices from Milan to Palermo. I was 23 when Donatello Vesperi came to claim what was left of my family. My father had died the way men in our world usually die, quickly, and with a reason no one bothered to explain to me. My mother followed him within the year. From grief or from fear, I've never been sure which kills faster. That left me the last Ferrante standing, the final piece of a territory the Vesperis had been circling for a generation. He didn't propose. He informed me. There is a difference, and I learned it the hard way, standing in my father's old study while Donatello explained, in the gentlest voice I'd ever heard him use, that our family's merger would be so much cleaner if it came with a ring instead of a war. I said yes, because the alternative was watching the last of my people die for a pride I couldn't afford. I told myself it was a kind of victory. I was young enough to believe that. The wedding was black silk and blood-red roses, 300 guests and at least half that many bodyguards. Donatello stood at the altar like a man accepting a delivery, and when he finally smiled at me, I remember feeling something dangerously close to hope. He told me, that night, that I was his equal. He told me I was safe. He told me, and I didn't understand yet how much of a warning this was, that the only way I would ever leave him was in death. For a while, it almost looked true. He built a version of a marriage around me that had all the right furniture, attention, luxury, a honeymoon at a villa overlooking the very lake that would later try to swallow me whole, 3 weeks of heat and silk sheets, and a man who watched me like I was something rare he'd finally acquired. I mistook possession for devotion more times than I'm proud of. The cracks came slowly, the way they always do. A meeting I wasn't invited to. A phone that went silent whenever I entered a room. Men who used to meet my eyes when they spoke to me and started instead addressing my husband as if I were furniture with good posture. I told myself this was simply how the world worked. I told myself a great many things that year. Then came the night that ended it. A rival shipment, Alessio Conti's people, though I didn't know that name yet, not the way I'd come to know it, was hid outside Trieste. Men died. Money disappeared. And somewhere in the chaos that followed, someone whispered my maiden name into Donatello's ear, because a Ferrante who married into Vesperi money was still, to some men, a Ferrante who might want her family's old roots back. He didn't ask me if it was true. That's the detail that still keeps me up some nights. 6 years of marriage, and my husband did not once look me in the eye and ask if I had betrayed him. He simply decided the way he decided everything, quickly, coldly, and with an audience in mind. I found out later that 3 of his captains watched from a distance as he drove me to the pier. He needed witnesses. He needed the story to travel exactly the way he told it. I remember the drive more than I remember the fall. The silence in that car had a texture to it, thick enough to choke on. I asked him what was wrong. He didn't answer. I asked him where we were going. He said, "Somewhere you'll understand." I believed, right up until the moment his hand closed around my arm at the edge of that pier, that whatever was coming, I could talk my way out of it. I had always been able to talk my way out of things with Donatello. That was the last night I believed that about myself. He said the words I've already told you. You took from me, now the lake takes from you. And then there was only water, and cold, and the particular silence of a man who has already decided you're finished before you've stopped fighting. I want you to understand something before we go further. I am not telling you this, so you'll pity me. Pity is a door that only opens one way, and I stopped walking through it the moment I found that ladder in the dark. I'm telling you this because you need to understand exactly how much of a stranger I became to the woman who married him, and exactly how much of my father's daughter was still waiting underneath her, patient as rust, for the day the water would finally let her out. That day came 14 months ago. Tonight, I'm going to tell you what I did with it. I didn't plan to find Alessio Conti. In this world, you don't find the Widowmaker. He finds you when you're useful enough to be worth the risk. 3 weeks after the lake, half-starved and hiding in a stripped-out apartment above a shuttered bakery in Milan, I woke up to a man sitting in the only chair in the room, watching me the way you'd watch a fire you weren't sure had gone out yet. I should have been afraid. I was too tired to manage it properly. "You're supposed to be dead," he said. "So are half the people your family's killed," I answered, and something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, but close enough to it that I understood even then that I'd said the right thing. Alessio Conti had spent a decade being the reason Donatello Vesperi checked his mirrors twice before pulling out of a driveway. Their families had been carving up the same territories in blood since before either of us was born, and if Donatello was winter, cold and patient, Alessio was the fire that outlasts it, controlled, deliberate, never wasted. He told me plainly that he'd had someone watching the lake house for months, waiting for Donatello to slip. He hadn't expected the slip to climb out of the water on its own. "I'm not interested in revenge for its own sake," he told me that first night, and I laughed, because it was the first thing anyone had said to me in 3 weeks that sounded like a lie worth admiring. "I'm interested in Donatello Vesperi, weak enough that he can't stop what comes next. You want to help me get there? I'll teach you how." I asked him what he wanted in return. He said, "Proof that you're a Ferrante and not just a woman who married one." That was the offer. Not gentle, not romantic. A trade laid out on a table between two people who'd both been taught that mercy was a currency you spent on people you didn't need. I said yes before he finished explaining the terms. What else was there to do? I had no name anymore, no family, no husband who hadn't already buried me once. Alessio was offering me the one thing Donatello never had. The truth, spoken plainly, without a ring dressed up as a leash. What followed wasn't the luxury Donatello once wrapped around me like a gilded cage. There was no villa, no silk, no staff trained to anticipate my every want before I knew I wanted it. Alessio's world was function over comfort. Safe houses with good locks and bad heating, cars that never carried the same plates twice, men who didn't ask questions because Alessio had trained the questions out of them years ago. He gave me none of the gifts my husband once used to measure his ownership of me. He gave me something better. He gave me a gun and taught me to stop flinching when I fired it. He gave me a name, Ferrante, and made me say it out loud until it stopped sounding like a wound and started sounding like a warning. I won't pretend the surveillance didn't unsettle me at first. Alessio's men tracked my movements as closely as Donatello's ever had, though for entirely different reasons, not ownership, but investment. I understood, within the first month, that I had traded one kind of watchfulness for another. The difference was that Alessio's men were watching to keep me alive long enough to become dangerous. Donatello's men had only ever watched to keep me contained. There were nights, in that first cold apartment above the tunnels, when I lay awake and wondered whether I was building a weapon or becoming one. I decided, somewhere around the second month, that the distinction didn't matter anymore. My husband had already decided what I was the night he chose a lake over a conversation. I was simply choosing, finally, what I did with that decision. Alessio brought me the ledgers in my 4th month with him, not my father's, not yet, but records of Vesperi shipping routes, payment trails, the names of the officials who'd made Donatello's rise possible. "Learn this," he told me, "and you'll understand your husband's empire better than he does." I studied those pages until the ink blurred, until I could recite supply chains the way other women recited prayers. I was building something. I didn't yet know how large. By the time winter thinned into spring, I had a new understanding of the man I'd married. Not as a husband, not even as an enemy, but as a structure. Buildings can be brought down if you know exactly where the weight is carried. I intended to know. Engagement question. If you found out the person who pushed you under never once asked whether you were guilty, would you want the truth to come out quietly, or would you want the whole world watching when it did? Tell me in the comments. There's a version of the story where I tell you Alessio was the only reason I survived. That version is only half true. The whole truth has a name, and her name is Ilaria. My cousin, the only Ferrante blood left in the world besides me, tucked away in a convent school outside Bergamo under a name that wasn't hers, kept safe by a network of favors my father had built before I was old enough to understand what favors cost. I hadn't seen her since the wedding. I hadn't dared reach for her, not once in 6 years of marriage, because reaching for her would have told Donatello exactly where the last loose thread of the Ferrante line was hiding. Alessio found her before I did. That should have frightened me more than it did. "She's not a bargaining chip," he told me, the night he finally admitted his men had confirmed her location. "I'm telling you, because you need a reason bigger than hatred to keep going. Hatred burns out, family doesn't." I went to her in the dead of a Tuesday, wearing a coat that wasn't mine and a face I barely recognized in the convent's cracked hallway mirror. She was 17 now, all sharp cheekbones and my mother's eyes, and when she saw me, she didn't scream, didn't faint, didn't do any of the things you'd expect from a girl confronting a ghost. She simply said, "I knew you weren't really gone." And I understood in that moment exactly what I was fighting to protect. The convent's mother superior had grown suspicious of a man who'd been asking questions in the village, one of Donatello's, sniffing along old Ferrante bloodlines the way he always did when he sensed a loose end. Ilaria wasn't safe there anymore, and she hadn't been for weeks. I hadn't known. I'd been so buried in ledgers and revenge that I'd let the one person I was supposedly avenging drift unprotected. Alessio moved her within the day. Different city, different papers, a small apartment above a flower shop with 2 of his most trusted men rotating watch around the clock. He did it without being asked, without expecting thanks. In the quiet, efficient way he did everything that mattered. I stood in that flower shop stairwell and felt something I hadn't let myself feel since the lake. Gratitude sharp enough to hurt. "You didn't have to do that," I told him. "I know," he said. "That's what makes it worth something." I understood then the shape of the debt I now carried, not the kind Donatello had once tried to collect from me with silk dresses and locked doors, but the kind that comes from someone choosing to protect what you love without being asked to. I owed Alessio Conti something I couldn't yet name, and he knew it, and neither of us mentioned it again, because we didn't need to. It was around that time he brought me into the real business, not the ledgers anymore, but the rooms where decisions got made. A negotiation with a shipping contact who'd once worked Vesperi docks and wanted out from under Donatello's thumb. Alessio put me at the table, introduced me by my full name, and let the room absorb the fact that a Ferrante had risen from the lake and was now sitting across from men who used to fear her family's name. I watched the shipping contact's face change when he understood who I was. I watched Alessio's men straighten, just slightly, the way men do when they realize the ground has shifted under a table they thought was steady. I said little, that first meeting. I mostly listened, mostly watched, mostly let my presence do the work my words weren't ready to do yet. But I felt, for the first time since the water closed over my head, something that wasn't fear or grief. I felt useful. I felt like a weapon finally being pointed in the right direction. By the end of that meeting, the shipping contact had agreed to feed us Vesperi manifests for the next 6 months. Alessio thanked him, shook his hand, and on the way out told me, quietly, "You did that, not me." He signed because a Ferrante asked, not because a Conti did. I didn't answer him. I didn't trust my voice yet to hold steady around a compliment that felt, for the first time in over a year, entirely earned. Word travels fast in our world, faster than any of us like to admit. Within weeks, rumors began circulating that the drowned Ferrante wife hadn't drowned at all. I let them travel. I wanted them to reach the one man who needed to hear them most, eventually, on his own terms and in his own time. Not yet. Not until I had enough to make the rumor unbearable. I told myself, for months, that whatever was growing between Alessio and me was simply proximity. Two people who'd survived the same enemy, sharing safe houses and strategy and the particular exhaustion of building something out of nothing. I was good at lying to myself. I'd had practice. It broke apart on a night in early autumn, in a warehouse office that smelled like diesel and old paper, after a supply run that had gone sideways and left one of Alessio's men with a bullet graze he refused to let anyone treat before the debrief was finished. I'd been running on adrenaline for 6 hours by the time the last of his people cleared out, and when the door shut behind them, the silence between Alessio and me had a weight to it I hadn't felt since the lake. "You could have been killed tonight," he said, not looking at me, arranging papers he didn't need to arrange. "So could you." "That's not the same thing." His voice had an edge I hadn't heard from him before. Not anger, something closer to fear wearing anger's clothes. "I didn't pull you out of that water to watch you die for a shipment." "You didn't pull me out of the water at all," I said. "I did that myself." He turned then, and the look on his face stopped whatever else I'd been about to say. Alessio Conti had spent a decade being unreadable to men far more dangerous than me, and in that moment, I watched the careful architecture of his control come apart at the edges. "You keep saying that like it makes you untouchable," he said. "It doesn't. It makes you reckless. And I can't." He stopped himself. "You can't what?" "I can't lose the one thing in this war that still feels like it's worth fighting for," he said, and the words landed somewhere in my chest I hadn't let anyone near since the wedding. I told myself later that I moved first. The truth is murkier than that. Some collision of exhaustion and gratitude and the particular ache of being wanted by someone who'd never once tried to own me. His hands found my face like he was asking permission and taking it in the same motion. And when he kissed me, it didn't feel like Donatello's kind of claiming. It felt like being chosen, which was a language I'd almost forgotten how to speak. I pulled back first, eventually, breath uneven, some old instinct screaming that wanting anything this much made you exactly the kind of vulnerable that got you thrown off a pier. This complicates things, I said. Everything about you complicates things, Alessio said, and there was no apology in it. I'm not going to pretend I didn't know that the day I sat in your apartment and decided to keep you alive. I left that warehouse office with my pulse still uneven and a fear lodged somewhere under my ribs that had nothing to do with Donatello Vesperi. Wanting Alessio Conti felt like handing someone a second rope after the first one had already tried to drown me. I wasn't ready to trust my own hands with that kind of weight again. We didn't speak of it directly for 2 weeks. We didn't need to. It lived in the space between us anyway, in the way his hand found the small of my back when we walked into rooms full of men who might still be loyal to my husband, in the way I started reaching for his opinion before my own when a plan felt uncertain, in the charged quiet that settled over every room we occupied alone together. I told myself I was managing it. I wasn't managing anything. I was falling, slowly and against every survival instinct I'd spent a year rebuilding, for a man my husband had taught me, for 6 years, to think of as the enemy. It was Ilaria, of all people, who said it plainly, during a visit to her flower shop apartment. You look at him the way you never looked at Donatello, she said, not unkindly. Even before the wedding. I didn't deny it. I'd run out of the energy denial required. What frightened me most wasn't the wanting. It was how much I'd started needing him steady beside me while I built the machine that would finally break my husband apart. I had promised myself, in the cold weeks after the lake, that I would never again let my safety depend on a man's goodwill. And here I was, falling for one anyway. The difference being, this time, I'd chosen it with my eyes open. The truth about Alessio came out the way most truths do in our world, not offered freely, but pried loose by circumstance. We were 3 days from finishing what we'd started, the ledgers assembled, the footage prepared. The network of officials Donatello had bought quietly informed that their arrangement with him was about to become a liability. I should have been focused entirely on the war ahead. Instead, I found myself in Alessio's study at 2 a.m, unable to sleep, going through a box of old photographs he kept locked in a drawer I wasn't supposed to know about. He found me there. I expected anger. I got something closer to grief. That's my sister, he said, nodding to a photograph of a young woman with his same sharp jaw, laughing at something outside the frame. Her name was Beatrice. She died the year before you married Donatello. I asked how. He was quiet long enough that I thought he wouldn't answer. Vesperi men, he said finally. A dispute over territory that had nothing to do with her. She was in the wrong car at the wrong time, and Donatello's father decided collateral damage was an acceptable cost of doing business. Donatello was there. He was young, new to the family's real work, and he didn't pull the trigger. But he didn't stop it either. He stood there and let it happen because stopping it would have cost him standing with his own father. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, understanding, finally, the true architecture of Alessio's decade-long war with my husband. It had never been about territory at all. Or rather, territory was the excuse men like Donatello used to dress up something far more personal. A grief Alessio had spent 10 years turning into precision instead of letting it turn him reckless. You never told me, I said. You never asked why I hated him enough to spend a decade dismantling everything he built, Alessio said. I assumed you'd guess eventually. I didn't want it to be the reason you trusted me. There was more. There always is. Alessio told me, that night, about the years he'd spent building alliances specifically designed to starve Vesperi supply lines, about informants planted inside Donatello's organization years before I ever climbed out of that lake, about a plan for Donatello's downfall that had existed long before I became useful to it. I understood, sitting there in the low lamplight of his study, that I hadn't stumbled into someone else's war by accident. I'd been, in some sense, exactly what Alessio had been waiting for. A Ferrante with a grievance sharp enough to match his own, willing to do what his informants alone couldn't. I asked him carefully whether that meant I was useful to him or wanted by him. He didn't answer with words. He crossed the room, took my face in both hands the way he had that first night in the warehouse, and said, "Both." I didn't expect both. I've spent 10 years telling myself I only had room for one kind of purpose. You ruined that plan the day you refused to stay dead. I believed him. I'd learned, by then, the particular shape of his honesty. Blunt, unpolished, never softened for my comfort. It was the opposite of everything Donatello had ever offered me, and I understood finally why I'd let myself fall for a man my husband had spent a decade trying to erase. Alessio Conti had never once tried to own me. He'd only ever tried to make sure I survived long enough to choose things for myself. There was one more revelation that night, the one that changed the shape of everything ahead of us. Alessio's informant inside Donatello's organization, a low-level courier named Paolo, easily overlooked, exactly the kind of man Donatello never bothered to watch closely, had confirmed something we'd suspected for months. Donatello knew, or at least suspected, that his drowned wife was alive. He'd known for weeks. And rather than hunting me down, he'd been quietly preparing his own countermove, moving assets, tightening loyalty among his captains, readying himself for a war he now believed was inevitable. The water was no longer the only thing standing between us. Now it was a man who knew exactly what was coming and had decided, with the same cold calculation he'd once used to decide my guilt, that he would rather destroy everything than lose it to me. Engagement question. When you finally learn the real reason behind someone's decade of vengeance, does it make you trust them more? Or does it make you wonder what else they haven't told you? I want to hear your theory before the next act. Knowing Donatello suspected I was alive changed the timeline. It also very nearly cost me the one person I couldn't afford to lose twice. We moved on the plan faster than intended. The first cut, we'd started calling it, though in truth it was less a single strike and more the beginning of a slow bleed. A shipment vanished outside Trieste, the same route where the original betrayal had been born, a symmetry Alessio insisted on, and I didn't argue against. Then came something louder. Rocco Santini, one of Donatello's most trusted underbosses, the man who'd stood witness on that pier 14 months earlier and said nothing while his boss decided my fate, found floating in the same lake that had once tried to take me, a single Ferrante rose tucked into his jacket pocket. I hadn't ordered it. I want that understood clearly. Alessio's people had acted on old instructions, a contingency built before I fully understood what I was building, and when I found out, I felt something close to sickness. Not because Rocco didn't deserve consequences. He'd stood on that pier and let a woman drown rather than risk his own standing, but because it meant the war had teeth now that I hadn't fully chosen, moving faster than my control over it. "This isn't what I wanted," I told Alessio in the aftermath, my voice sharper than I intended. "This is what war looks like," he said, not unkindly, but without apology either. "You can't build a fire and be surprised when it burns something you didn't point it at." We argued that night, the first real argument since the warehouse, about how much control I actually had over the machine we'd built together. I accused him of moving pieces without me. He accused me of wanting a clean revenge that didn't exist in a world built on decades of blood. Neither of us was entirely wrong. I went to bed that night furious and frightened in equal measure, uncertain for the first time whether I trusted the man I'd fallen for as much as I'd told myself I did. Donatello's response came faster than we expected. 2 nights later, a car forced Alessio's off the road outside Bergamo, close enough to Ilaria's flower shop that my blood went cold the moment I heard. He survived, barely, a graze along his ribs, and a concussion that kept him unsteady for days. But the message was unmistakable. Donatello knew exactly where the people I loved were positioned. He was showing me he could reach any of them, whenever he chose. I sat beside Alessio's hospital bed, a private clinic, one of his own doctors, nothing that would ever show up in a record Donatello's people could trace, and felt the particular terror of loving someone in a world that punishes love as a weakness. This is exactly what he wants, I told him, once the fear had cooled enough to think clearly. He wants me paralyzed, second-guessing every move because I'm afraid of what it costs the people I care about. Then don't give him that, Alessio said, voice rough with pain and something steadier underneath it. Selvaggia, look at me. You didn't survive that lake to spend the rest of your life negotiating with your own fear. He was right, and knowing it didn't make the fear smaller. I moved Ilaria again that week, further away this time, with protection Alessio trusted with his life. I doubled security around every safe house we operated from, and I began to understand, with a clarity that frightened me more than Donatello's threats did, that finishing this, truly finishing it, meant risking everything I'd only just started to let myself want. There was a moment, in the sterile quiet of that clinic room, when I let myself imagine simply disappearing. Taking Ilaria, taking whatever money we'd assembled, vanishing somewhere Donatello's reach couldn't follow, letting the ledgers rot unused in a drawer. I imagined a life where I never had to look my husband in the eye again, where the reckoning stayed a fantasy instead of a plan. I let myself hold that image for exactly one night. Then I thought of Rocco's men on that pier, watching and saying nothing. I thought of the 14 months I'd spent learning to breathe in the dark. I thought of Alessio's sister, dead in a car that had nothing to do with her, and Ilaria, hidden away for 6 years because the world I married into made her existence a liability. Disappearing would keep us safe. It would also mean Donatello Vesperi walked away from everything he'd done without ever once understanding what it cost. I chose the reckoning. I chose it with clear eyes this time, not the desperate fury of a woman freshly pulled from the water, but the deliberate resolve of one who finally understood exactly what she was risking and decided the cost was worth paying. The third cut was the one that finally reached him. We released the footage, the original 2756, cleaned and sharpened until every second of it was undeniable, sent quietly to every major family from Milan to Palermo, with 4 words attached. He left me to drown. I learned how to swim. I watched, over the following weeks, the particular slow collapse of a man who had built his entire identity on being untouchable. Alliances that had stood for a decade began quietly dissolving. Money that should have moved through Vesperi accounts started finding other routes. Other families suddenly less willing to do business with a man who'd been caught, in his own captain's words, drowning his own wife over a rumor he'd never bothered to verify. The politicians who'd once answered his calls within minutes began letting them ring through to voicemail. Alessio's informant, Paolo, reported that Donatello had started sleeping with a gun beside the bed, that he stared at the empty side of his own mattress some nights, the way a man stares at a debt he can't pay. I felt no triumph reading that report, only a strange, heavy quiet. I had spent so long imagining this moment that its arrival left me hollowed rather than satisfied. It was Alessio, healing but still moving carefully from his injuries, who noticed the shift in me first. "You don't have to feel guilty for this," he said one evening, watching me stare at nothing over a cup of coffee neither of us had touched. "He didn't feel guilty pushing you." "I know," I said. "I'm not guilty. I think I'm just tired of being someone whose whole life is built around another person's downfall. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I hadn't expected. Then let's finish it, and build something after that isn't about him at all. It was the first time either of us had spoken plainly about what came next, not the war, but the after. I hadn't let myself imagine an after in over a year. Every plan I'd made since the lake had been built around Donatello's ending, and somewhere in the exhaustion of that single-minded purpose, I'd forgotten to imagine anything for myself once it was finished. Alessio's question cracked something open in me I hadn't realized I'd sealed shut. What would that even look like? I asked him, and I meant it as a real question, not a rhetorical one. I don't know yet, he admitted, but I know I don't want it to be more war. I've spent 10 years letting Beatrice's death define every decision I make. I think I'm done letting the dead choose my future for me. He reached across the table, took my hand, and said, I'd like it to look like you and me, actually building something instead of only tearing something down. I let myself cry. Then, for the first time since the lake, not from grief, but from the strange, disorienting relief of being offered a future by someone who wasn't asking me to earn it first. Donatello had made me feel, for 6 years, that safety was something I had to constantly justify. Alessio offered it to me freely, in a kitchen that smelled like burnt coffee, without conditions attached. The final piece fell into place 3 days later. Giancarlo Moretti, Donatello's own consigliere, the man who'd advised him for 15 years, who'd stood beside him through every rise and every ruthless decision, reached out to Alessio's network quietly, looking for terms. He'd read the ledgers we'd begun circulating among the families. He'd seen his own name in them, buried among Donatello's dirtiest arrangements, and understood with a clarity that must have cost him something that loyalty to a drowning man wasn't worth going down with him. Giancarlo gave us everything: Donatello's remaining safe houses, his financial structure, the precise schedule of the gala he was hosting in 10 days' time, a desperate show of strength meant to convince the remaining families his empire was still standing, still worth aligning with. It was, Giancarlo told us, Donatello's last real chance to hold what remained together. It would also be the last night he ever believed he was untouchable. The gala was held at the Vesperi estate, the same house I'd once called home, dressed in the same black silk and blood-red roses that had decorated our wedding 6 years earlier. I imagine Donatello chose that symmetry deliberately. He always did love a story he could control the shape of. I walked in through the front doors, not the servants' entrance, not smuggled in shadow the way his men would have expected the drowned wife to arrive if she dared show her face at all. I walked in on Alessio's arm, wearing a dress the exact color of the one I'd worn the night he pushed me into the lake, and I watched 300 guests go silent, one by one, as they understood who was standing in the doorway. Donatello's face, when he finally turned and saw me, held an expression I'd never once seen on him in 6 years of marriage. Not calm, not control. Fear, raw and unguarded. The same fear I imagine I wore the moment his hand closed around my arm at the edge of that pier. "You're supposed to be dead," he said, echoing, without knowing it, the exact words Alessio had said to me the night we met. "I was," I told him, loud enough for the room to hear. "The lake gave me back everything you thought you'd taken." What happened next unfolded faster than any of us had rehearsed for, because Donatello, cornered and desperate, did exactly what desperate men do. He reached for the gun his own captain carried at his side, and for one suspended second, the entire gala held its breath along with me. Alesio moved first, faster than I could process, putting himself between Donatello's weapon and me, not out of recklessness, but out of the same instinct that had made him move Ilaria to safety without being asked. The shot went wide, shattering a chandelier crystal instead of a body, and in the chaos that followed, Giancarlo Moretti, the consigliere who had already chosen his side, stepped forward and disarmed his own boss in front of every family that mattered. "It's over, Donatello," Giancarlo said, and there was no cruelty in it, only exhaustion, the voice of a man who had carried too many secrets for too long and had finally set them down. "The families have seen the ledgers, they've seen the footage. There is nothing left here for any of us to protect." I watched my husband, my ex-husband, in every way that mattered, understand in real time that the empire he'd built by drowning inconvenient truths had finally caught up with him in the one room he'd never expected it to reach. The families who had gathered to watch him prove his strength instead watched him disarmed by his own consigliere, exposed by a wife he'd left to die, in the very house where he'd once promised I'd never leave except in death. He looked at me in that final moment, and I saw the same truth the lake had already taught me. "Some women do not die when you push them under," I told him, quiet enough that only he could hear it. "They learn how to breathe in the dark, and then they rise." I didn't kill him. I want you to understand that clearly, because I know some of you were hoping for it, and there were nights in that cold Milan apartment when I hoped for it too. But killing him would have made me the ending he always expected, a Ferrante finishing a blood feud the way blood feuds have always been finished in our world. I wanted something crueler than his death. I wanted him alive to watch everything he built dissolve without him. The families, informed and no longer afraid, turned their backs on him one by one as they left that gala. His empire didn't end with a bullet. It ended with silence, the same silence he once mistook for my absence. 6 months later, Alessio and I stood on a different balcony, overlooking a different water, the sea outside Genoa, nothing like the cold, betraying lake that had once tried to end me. Ilaria was safe finally, living openly under her own name for the first time since she was a child, studying in Bologna and calling twice a week just to hear my voice, proof against the ghost of everything I'd almost lost. The Ferrante ledgers had been handed, quietly, to people who could use them to keep the world a little more honest than we'd found it. Alessio took my hand that evening, the same hand he'd taken across a kitchen table months earlier, and said, "No conditions, no ownership, just this, if you still want it." I did. I do. I am not the woman Donatello Vesperi pushed off that pier 14 months ago. She died in the water, the way he intended. What rose in her place chose, this time, exactly who deserved to keep her, and it was never going to be a man who mistook love for a leash. It was always going to be the one who taught me that being chosen doesn't have to feel like drowning at all. Engagement question. If you'd built your whole life back out of nothing but fury and a lake full of secrets, would you have let him live, or would you have finished what he started? Tell me which ending you would have written. If you made it all the way to the surface with Selvaggia tonight, thank you for staying in the dark with me. Stories like this one live and breathe because of you. Every comment, every theory, every "I would have done it differently" tells me you're still hooked. If you want more nights like this one, hit subscribe, ring that bell, and I'll see you at the water's edge for the next story. Until then, stay close, and don't trust the quiet ones.